The marble feels cold beneath my knees, or maybe that is just shock turning my blood to ice as I watch Marcus die in front of me. Marcus Chen, bodyguard number 4 in 3 months, is pressing his hand against the wound in his chest, but the blood keeps coming, spreading across the white Italian marble in a crimson pool that reflects the crystal chandelier above us. His lips move and I lean closer, even though every instinct screams at me to run, to hide, to do anything except kneel here in the hallway outside my penthouse watching another man die trying to protect me. Inside, his voice is barely a whisper, wet and broken. Someone inside wants you dead, Miss Ashworth. Not outside. Inside. The words hit harder than the gunshots that still echo in my ears. I open my mouth to ask who, to demand answers. But his eyes go distant and empty, and I know he is gone before his hand falls away from the wound. I hear footsteps then, measured and unhurried, the sound of men who know their target is cornered. My hands are shaking so badly I cannot get my phone out of my clutch purse, the small silver evening bag suddenly impossibly complex as I fumble with the clasp. I am wearing a cocktail dress, Valentino, deep green silk that cost more than most people make in a month, and I register with bizarre clarity that Marcus's blood has splattered across the hem. The footsteps grow louder. 2 men round the corner from the stairwell, and I recognize the cold professionalism in their movements, the way they hold their weapons. These are not street thugs or desperate criminals. These are operators, trained and efficient, and they are here to finish what they started. I should run, but my legs will not move, frozen in this tableau of death and marble and crystal light. The taller one raises his weapon, and I see my death in his eyes, certain and inevitable. And all I can think is that I am 26 years old, and I have never truly lived, never been anything except Thomas Ashworth's daughter, a possession wrapped in designer clothes and kept behind walls of security that apparently mean nothing. Then I hear it. The squeak of wheels on marble, rhythmic and completely incongruous with the moment. A janitor's cart appears around the opposite corner, pushed by a man in a gray uniform I have seen 100 times, but never really noticed. One of the invisible people who clean these halls after midnight, when residents like me are asleep or out living our carefully guarded lives. He stops when he sees us, this frozen scene of death, and his eyes meet mine across the blood-soaked corridor. Something shifts in his expression, subtle but absolute, like a mask dropping away to reveal something dangerous underneath. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The janitor moves before the gunmen fully register his presence, and the transformation is so complete and sudden that I almost do not believe what I am seeing. He shoves his cart forward with explosive force, sending it rolling directly into the legs of the nearer assassin, the metal frame connecting with a sickening crack that echoes in the hallway. The man stumbles, weapon tracking away from me for just a second, and the janitor is already moving, crossing the distance between them with the fluid efficiency of someone who has done violence so many times it has become muscle memory. He grabs the fire extinguisher from his cart as he passes, swinging it in a brutal arc that connects with the stumbling gunman's temple, and I hear the wet crunch of impact, see the man collapse like his strings have been cut. The second assassin is already adjusting, weapons swinging toward this new threat. But the janitor moves with him, using the first man's falling body as a shield as he closes distance. He sprays the extinguisher directly into the second assassin's face, white chemical cloud erupting between them, and then he is inside the man's guard, one hand controlling the weapon arm while the other drives the base of the extinguisher into his throat. The fight is over in less than 8 seconds, both men on the ground, one unconscious and one choking, and the janitor stands there breathing hard, gray uniform streaked with the chemical powder, and when he looks at me again, his eyes are not the eyes of any janitor I have ever seen. They are cold and calculating and utterly certain, the eyes of someone who has looked at death so many times They are on familiar terms. He crosses to me in 3 long strides, and his hand closes around my upper arm, grip firm enough to hurt, firm enough to cut through the shock that has paralyzed me. "Come with me if you want to survive the next 10 minutes," he says, and his voice is nothing like I expected, low and rough and carrying absolute authority that makes me respond without thinking. I let him pull me to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me, and I cannot stop looking at the bodies on the floor. Marcus dead, and 2 more men down. The hallway that has always represented safety and luxury, now a war zone. "Who are you?" I manage to ask. But he is already moving, pulling me away from my penthouse door, away from everything familiar. He does not answer, just keeps moving with purpose, one hand still gripping my arm and the other holding a weapon he pulled from one of the fallen men. And I realize with a clarity that cuts through everything else that this man has been waiting for this moment, preparing for it. And somehow that is more terrifying than the assassins, because it means he knew this was coming, and he let me walk around in ignorance while death circled closer. We reach the service elevator and he jabs the call button repeatedly, eyes scanning the hallway behind us. And I see the scars on his hands now, old white lines across knuckles and the back of his right hand. The kind of scars that tell stories of violence survived. The service elevator doors close with a metallic whisper, and I feel the lurch in my stomach as we descend. Or maybe that is just the shock finally catching up to me. My heels slip on the floor, and I look down to see Marcus's blood on the soles of my Louboutins, dark and sticky, and the sight makes something twist in my chest. "Who are you?" I demand again, but the janitor is focused on his phone, thumbs moving rapidly across the screen in a way that seems impossibly wrong for someone in a gray maintenance uniform with a name tag that reads, James. I grab his arm, the one not holding the stolen weapon, and force him to look at me. "Tell me what is happening right now, or I swear I will start screaming." He glances at me then, really looks at me for the first time since we entered this descending metal box, and what I see in his face stops my breath. Exhaustion lives there, carved into lines around his eyes and mouth, and something that looks almost like regret. The elevator passes the lobby level and keeps going down toward the basement and parking levels, and my heart starts racing faster because this is wrong. We should be going to the lobby where there are people and cameras and some pretense of safety. He slides his phone into his pocket and turns to face me fully, and I notice details I missed before in the chaos. The tactical watch barely visible beneath his sleeve cuff, the way he stands with his weight balanced like a fighter, the absolute calm in his eyes despite having just killed or incapacitated 2 men. "I was planted here 6 months ago," he says, voice low and controlled. "Every bodyguard assigned to you was compromised before they even arrived. Your father knew there was a leak close to home. He hired me through a separate channel, one even his inner circle did not know about. The words hit me like physical blows. 6 months. This man has been invisible to me for half a year, mopping floors and emptying trash and watching me live my oblivious life while death circled closer. You have been watching me, I say, and I hear the tremor in my voice. He does not deny it, does not soften it with apology or explanation. Yes, your schedule, your routines, your vulnerabilities, everything. The intimacy of that surveillance makes my skin crawl, and somehow simultaneously makes me feel safer than I have felt since Marcus stopped breathing. This stranger knows me in ways my own bodyguards never did, has studied me like a puzzle he needed to solve. "Why did you wait?" I ask. "Why let 4 men die if you knew they were compromised?" The elevator shudders to a stop at the lowest basement level, and the doors slide open onto concrete and fluorescent lighting and the smell of motor oil. He steps out first, weapon up, scanning the parking garage with practiced efficiency before pulling me out beside him. "Because I needed proof of who was sending them," he says. "And because your father needed to know how deep the betrayal ran. Now we know. The entire chain is poisoned." He starts moving toward a section of the garage I have never been to, the service vehicle area. And I follow, because what choice do I have except to trust this man who has been a ghost in my life for 6 months and is now the only thing standing between me and whoever wants me dead. The maintenance tunnel smells like concrete dust and old water, and my heels echo against the floor with each awkward step. The sound bouncing off walls I can barely see in the dim emergency lighting that casts everything in sickly yellow tones. James moves ahead of me with absolute certainty, never hesitating at intersections or pausing to orient himself, and I realize with a clarity that makes my chest tight that he has walked these tunnels before, has mapped every passage and exit in preparation for exactly this scenario. He knows the infrastructure of my building better than I do, knows the skeleton beneath the luxury, and I have passed him dozens of times in hallways without ever truly seeing him. The intimacy of that surveillance should terrify me more than it does, but instead, I find it strangely comforting. The idea that someone has been watching over me even when I did not know I needed protection. My dress catches on a protruding pipe and tears with a sound that seems obscenely loud in the confined space, silk giving way like all the expensive, fragile things in my life. And I stumble, but James turns immediately, hand shooting out to steady me, his grip on my elbow firm and warm through the thin fabric. "You need to move faster," he says, but his voice has lost some of its earlier hardness, and in the yellow light I can see his face more clearly, the strong jaw shadowed with stubble, the eyes that are gray or maybe blue, I cannot tell in this light. "Who sent you?" I ask again, because I need to anchor myself to something concrete, some explanation that makes sense of the last 15 minutes of my life. He hesitates, and in that hesitation I see calculation, the weighing of information and risk. "Your father," he finally says, and the words settle over me like cold water. Thomas Ashworth hired me through a contact outside his organization, someone he trusted from before he built his empire. He suspected betrayal close to home, suspected someone was positioning to move against him by eliminating you first. I was insurance, the failsafe no one else knew about. My father knew, I say. And the betrayal of that knowledge cuts deeper than anything else tonight. He knew I was in danger, and he did not tell me. James looks at me then with something that might be sympathy. He was trying to protect you from the knowledge, keep you living normally while he investigated who he could still trust. Turns out he could not trust anyone in his inner circle. 4 bodyguards dead proves that. Richard Montague has been systematically placing assassins in protective roles, waiting for the right moment to strike. We reach a heavy metal door marked with faded lettering I cannot read, and James produces a key from somewhere in his uniform, the lock turning with a grinding sound that speaks of disuse. Beyond the door is a parking structure I do not recognize, lower level than even the resident parking, the service area where delivery trucks and maintenance vehicles access the building. A nondescript gray sedan waits in the shadows, and James guides me toward it with his hand on my lower back, the touch somehow more intimate than when he gripped my arm, and I realize that everything has changed, that the man I never noticed has become the only solid thing in a world that has tilted sideways into nightmare. The apartment James brings me to exists in a different world than the one I left bleeding on marble floors an hour ago, a cramped third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood where graffiti marks the walls, and the hallway smells like old cooking oil and something sour I cannot identify. He unlocks 3 separate locks on a door that looks like it has been kicked in before, and inside the space is small and anonymous, furnished with second-hand furniture that could belong to anyone or no one, the kind of place you pass through without leaving a mark. I stand in the center of the tiny living room still wearing my cocktail dress, and when I look down, I see Marcus's blood has dried into stiff dark patches on the midnight blue silk, and my hands start shaking so badly I have to clasp them together. James moves through the apartment with efficiency, checking windows and sightlines before turning back to me with an expression I cannot read. You need to clean up and change, he says, and pulls clothing from a duffel bag I had not noticed in the corner, simple jeans and a plain gray shirt that look like they would fit me, though I do not want to think about how he knew my size. The bathroom is down the hall, first door. Be quick. I take the clothes and move like a sleepwalker into the cramped bathroom with its chipped tile and flickering fluorescent light, and when I catch sight of myself in the mirror, I do not recognize the woman staring back. Her carefully styled hair disheveled, and her makeup smeared, and something wild and terrified living in her eyes. I strip off the ruined dress and let it fall to the floor, wash my hands in water that runs cold, then lukewarm but never truly hot, and watch Marcus's blood swirl down the drain in pink spirals. My hands shake as I dry them, as I pull on the borrowed clothes that smell like laundry detergent and nothing else, and I realize I'm going into shock, the adrenaline finally ebbing and leaving me hollow. When I emerge, James is on his phone, voice low and clipped, speaking in a tone I have never heard from him before. Military precise and stripped of anything casual. Confirmed 4 bodies at the primary location, he says. No sign of the primary asset. Assume capture or elimination. I need intel on secondary locations within the hour. He notices me, and his eyes do a quick assessment, checking that I am steady on my feet, that I have followed instructions, and then he ends the call without preamble. I move closer, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet, and I hear my voice ask the question I am terrified to have answered. What happened to my father? James slides his phone into his pocket and looks at me with an expression that combines exhaustion and something harder, something that looks like the face you make when delivering news that will break someone. Your father is missing, he says. His security team was hit 2 hours ago. Slaughtered in a coordinated strike. The entire organization is in chaos, and no one knows who is giving orders anymore. You are lying, I say, and the words come out harder than I intend, anger rising like a wave to cover the terror that threatens to drown me. You are part of this, part of whatever is happening, and I am supposed to just trust you, because you say my father sent you. James looks at me with those unreadable gray eyes and moves to the small table in the corner of the room, pulling a laptop from another bag I had not noticed, his movements economical and practiced. I am not asking you to trust me, he says as he opens the computer and turns it toward me. I am asking you to look at the evidence and decide for yourself. The screen fills with images that make my stomach turn. Photographs of men I recognize. Bodyguards who came before Marcus, each one dead in ways that were reported as accidents or random violence, but which I can see now follow a pattern. Here is Davidson, your bodyguard from 3 months ago, officially killed in a home invasion, but look at the wound pattern. Professional execution made to look like robbery. Here is Chen before him, car accident that was actually a cut brake line, and if you look at the traffic camera footage I pulled, you can see the man who accessed his vehicle the night before. James scrolls through more images, his voice clinical now, detached, and I realize he has been investigating this for months, building a case in the shadows while I lived in ignorant luxury. Every bodyguard assigned to you was selected by Richard Montague, he continues, and brings up financial records that mean nothing to me at first, until he highlights the patterns, payments flowing from offshore accounts controlled by the Volkov organization, your father's primary rivals. Richard has been on their payroll for at least 2 years, positioning himself to take over when Thomas falls. I stare at the screen and feel reality shifting beneath my feet, because Richard Montague has been part of my life since I was a child. The man who brought me presents on my birthday and called me Little Bird, and stood beside my father at my mother's funeral. He has been family in every way that matters except blood. This does not make sense, I say. But even as the words leave my mouth, I know that it makes perfect sense, that the pieces fit together with terrible clarity. Why would Richard need me dead to move against my father? James meets my eyes, and I see something there that might be respect for the question. Because your father's will leaves everything to you if you survive him, the entire organization, all assets, all control. And while you could theoretically sign it over to someone else, you would have to survive long enough to do so. With you dead, succession defaults to Thomas's designated second, which has always been Richard. Your death destabilizes your father emotionally and legally clears the path for Richard to assume control the moment Thomas dies or disappears. I think about my father, about the man who built an empire through violence and cunning, but who always made sure I had everything I needed, who kept me separate from his business and told me I would never have to be part of that world. He knew, I say quietly. He knew someone was coming for both of us, and he did not tell me. James closes the laptop, and his expression softens almost imperceptibly. He was trying to protect you, the only way he knew how, by keeping you in the dark while he investigated who he could still trust. Turns out the answer was no one in his inner circle, so he reached outside to someone Richard did not know existed. Night comes, and I lie on the narrow couch in the living room, while James insists I take the bedroom, but sleep feels impossible with adrenaline still singing through my veins and the image of Marcus bleeding out replaying every time I close my eyes. So eventually I give up and move quietly through the darkened apartment and find James exactly where I somehow knew he would be, sitting in a chair pulled close to the window with the curtain slightly parted, a gun resting in his lap like something natural and normal, his eyes scanning the street below with the kind of focus that never really turns off. He glances at me when I enter, but does not seem surprised, just shifts slightly to make room near the window, and I move to stand beside him, looking down at the street where a few cars pass and a couple argues on the corner, and life continues in its ordinary way while my entire world has collapsed. You should rest, he says quietly, but there is no real force behind it, as if he knows the futility of the suggestion. I cannot, I tell him, and he nods once, accepting this. We stand in silence for a moment, and then I ask the question that has been building since I watched him move through that maintenance tunnel with absolute certainty of every turn, since I saw him handle those gunmen with brutal efficiency, since I realized he has been watching me for 6 months while I never saw him at all. Who were you before you became a janitor? He is quiet for long enough that I think he will not answer, but then he speaks, his voice lower than before, rougher around the edges. Military first, he says. Special operations, the kind where they send you places that do not officially exist, to do things that never officially happened. I was good at it, maybe too good, and when they needed someone to disappear into deep cover work, they gave me a dishonorable discharge on paper and recruited me into something that does not have a name you would recognize. I spent 8 years doing contract work for people who needed problems solved quietly, and I told myself it was necessary, that I was serving some greater good. But mostly, I was just good at violence, and they paid well for it. His jaw tightens, and I see something move across his face, some memory or regret he does not voice. Your father found me through channels that take effort to access, offered me more money than I had seen in years to watch his daughter and keep her alive when everyone else failed, and I thought it would be simple, a babysitting job with good pay. Then I watched you for 6 months and realized you were a prisoner in a gilded cage, surrounded by people who saw you as a commodity or a liability, but never as a person, and somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a job. He turns to look at me fully now, and in the dim light from the street, his eyes hold something raw and unguarded. I have done terrible things, Eleanor, things I cannot take back and do not expect forgiveness for, and you should not trust what you feel right now, because fear and adrenaline make people cling to whoever is nearby. But I need you to know that keeping you alive has become the only thing that feels like it matters. Morning light filters through the thin curtains, and I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I wake on the couch with a blanket over me that I do not remember getting. And when I sit up, my body aches in ways I have never experienced, muscles sore from running, and fear and sleeping in an awkward position. And I see James still at the window, though he has moved to stand now, his posture suddenly rigid in a way that sends alarm racing through me even before he speaks. "We need to move," he says without looking at me, his voice tight and controlled. "Now." I am on my feet immediately, the blanket falling away, and I move to the window where he shifts slightly to let me see what he sees. And there on the street below are two men who look wrong for this neighborhood, too well dressed and too focused, and one of them is speaking into a phone while looking up at this building. "They found us," I say, and my voice sounds strange to my own ears, flat with shock because it has been less than 12 hours and we should have had more time. James is already moving, grabbing the bag he never fully unpacked, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. "They found us faster than I calculated, which means Richard has more resources deployed than I expected, probably called in favors from the Volkov network, and that changes everything." He looks at me, and I see the decision forming in his eyes even before he says it. "We cannot stay stationary, Eleanor. The moment we stop moving, we become targets. You need to understand that your life as you knew it is over. No safe houses, no secure locations, just constant motion until we identify every player in this hunt and neutralize the threat." I think about what he is saying, about running indefinitely, about never stopping, and some part of me that grew up with security and walls and people whose job was to keep me safe wants to protest, wants to demand a better solution. But I have seen 4 men die trying to protect me, and I watch James move through violence like water, and I know he is right. "Teach me," I say, and his eyes widen slightly as if he expected argument. "Teach me what I need to know to survive this." He holds my gaze for 3 seconds that feel longer, then nods once. "Back door," he says. "Stay close, move fast, and do exactly what I tell you when I tell you." We cross to the apartment door, and he checks the hallway through the peephole, then eases the door open, and I follow him toward the back stairs, while behind us, I hear the building's front entrance bang open and heavy footsteps on the lower stairs, and James grabs my hand, and we run, my borrowed sneakers silent on the concrete steps, and we burst through the back exit into an alley, just as I hear the apartment door splinter behind us, and then we are in the street, mixing with morning crowds, and James pulls me into the flow of people heading toward the subway, and I am running again, running into a life I do not know with the only person who seems capable of keeping me alive. My old existence falling away with every step, blood and luxury and the name Eleanor Ashworth left behind in the ruins. We take 3 trains going in different directions before James finally leads me to a neighborhood I do not recognize, industrial and quiet, where storage facilities line streets that see little traffic, and he uses a key to open a unit that looks identical to hundreds of others, pulling the rolling door up to reveal a space that speaks of careful preparation, methodical planning for contingencies I never imagined needing. Metal shelving holds plastic bins labeled with codes I do not understand, and there is a small table with a mirror, a duffel bag in the corner, and hanging on hooks are clothes in various sizes and styles, all chosen for anonymity rather than fashion. James moves through the space with purpose, pulling items from bins, and I watch him shed the last remnants of the janitor persona, changing into dark jeans and a fitted black shirt that reveals the lean muscle of someone who maintains readiness as a lifestyle, and when he turns to me with a box of hair dye in his hand, I feel something shift in my chest, because this is real, permanent, the erasure of Eleanor Ashworth beginning with something as simple as color. "Sit," he says, gesturing to the chair by the mirror, and I move to it slowly, seeing myself in the reflection, still recognizable despite the borrowed clothes, my blonde hair marking me as clearly as a spotlight. He stands behind me, and his hands are gentle when he touches my hair, sectioning it with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this before, and I wonder how many identities he has worn, how many times he has transformed himself into someone else. "This will burn a little," he warns, and then he is applying the dye with careful strokes, his fingers brushing my scalp, my neck, and the intimacy of it feels more profound than it should. This man who has killed for me now, performing this oddly tender service. I watch him in the mirror, and catch him watching me back, our eyes meeting in the reflection, and something passes between us that has nothing to do with survival strategy. While the dye processes, he brings me contact lenses in a brown so dark they will turn my blue eyes nearly black, and clothing that will help me disappear into crowds, jeans and plain shirts, and a jacket that looks worn enough to be unremarkable. "Try these," he says, handing me the contacts. And I fumble with them because I have never worn contacts before. And finally he steps close, too close, and says, "Let me help." His fingers tilt my chin up, and he holds my eye open with a touch so careful it makes my breath catch. And he slides the lens into place with precision, then does the other eye, and we are inches apart, his face filling my vision, and I see the exact moment his professional detachment fractures, because his hand lingers against my jaw, and his eyes drop to my mouth before he catches himself and steps back. "You need to understand something," he says, his voice rougher than before. "What you are feeling right now, what we both might be feeling, it is adrenaline and proximity, and the way fear makes everything more intense. Do not trust it. Do not trust this." I stand slowly, meeting his eyes with my new brown ones, and I feel anger rise sharp and clarifying. "You do not get to tell me what I feel or why I feel it," I say. "I have spent my entire life being told what to think and who to be and what I should want, and maybe you are right that fear makes things intense, but it also makes things clear. I see you, James. Maybe for the first time in my life I actually see someone clearly. And you can tell yourself this is just a job, but we both know you stopped believing that days ago." My words hang in the air between us, and James looks at me with something raw in his eyes before his phone vibrates and he turns away to check it. And the moment shatters like glass, professionalism sliding back over his features like armor, and he says we have incoming intel. My contact made it through. He taps the screen and I move closer to see. And what loads makes my chest tighten with emotions I cannot name, because there on the small screen are photographs, 3 of them, and in each one is my father. Thomas Ashworth sits in what looks like a basement, concrete walls behind him, his hands zip-tied to a metal chair, and his face is bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut, blood dried at the corner of his mouth, and I have never seen my father look anything but powerful, commanding, untouchable. And this broken man in the photographs is a stranger who wears his face. "He is alive," James says quietly, and I hear him continue talking, explaining what his contact learned. But the words wash over me like water because I cannot stop staring at the images, at the way my father's shoulders slump, at the vulnerability that I never imagined possible in a man who controlled an empire built on fear and loyalty. James touches my arm and I flinch back to the present, focusing on his voice. "Richard has not made his move public yet because he needs you dead first," James says, and his tone is careful, measured, like he is delivering news he knows will hurt. "Your father's will leaves everything to you if you outlive him, Eleanor. The entire organization, all assets, complete control. And Thomas never told you because he thought keeping you ignorant would keep you safe, but it just made you the target Richard had to eliminate before he could claim power." I process this information slowly, understanding dawning cold and certain. Richard cannot consolidate control while I live, because legally everything would be mine, not his, and every captain and soldier who might challenge him could rally behind my claim, and so I have to die before my father does, or Richard's coup falls apart before it begins. "The intelligence includes details," James continues, showing me text on the screen below the photos, and I read about the timeline, about how Richard plans to force my father to sign transfer documents under duress, then stage his death as a heart attack, natural causes that let Richard step in as the designated successor, but only if I am already gone, already buried, no competing heir to complicate the transition. "How long does my father have?" I ask, and my voice sounds strange, distant. 48 hours, maybe less," James says, and he is watching me closely, gauging my reaction. Richard is moving faster now that his people reported you dead at the safe house. He thinks he won. He thinks you burned in that building we escaped, and that gives us a window but not much of one. I look at the photos again, at my father's battered face, and something breaks open in my chest. Not grief exactly, but a complicated tangle of love and anger and fierce determination, because whatever our relationship has been, whatever mistakes he made, keeping me isolated and protected and ignorant, he is still my father, and he tried to save me by hiring James outside the corrupted channels, and I will not let Richard Montague take everything while my father dies in a basement. James must see something in my expression, because he steps closer and says, "We will get him out, Eleanor. I promise you that. But first we need to make Richard absolutely certain you are dead. Verification he cannot question. Because if he suspects you might be alive, he will move up his timeline and kill Thomas immediately." "What are you saying?" I ask, though I already know. James meets my eyes and says we have to stage your death in a way Richard's people will believe without doubt. And that means you have to die publicly, verifiably, completely, and you have to be willing to watch yourself be erased from existence. James makes calls through the night using encrypted channels and speaking to people whose names I will never know. And by dawn, he has assembled what he calls the necessary components, which sounds clinical until I understand he means a body from the morgue, a woman close enough to my age and build, and DNA samples he collected from my apartment before we fled, strands of my blonde hair and a toothbrush and clothing with my skin cells. Items that will sell the deception to forensic investigators who work for Richard. We drive before sunrise to a salvage yard where a contact has prepared a car, black sedan with plates registered to a shell corporation that traces back to accounts my father used for legitimate business, and James explains the plan with a detachment that I recognize now as his way of controlling emotion, his voice steady as he tells me the car will be driven remotely over an embankment on Highway 9 where the drop is steep and the crash will be catastrophic, and accelerants placed in the engine will ensure fire that burns hot enough to require dental records for identification. "The body," he says, and then stops and rephrases. "The substitute will be positioned in the driver's seat with your DNA evidence distributed appropriately, and the explosion will happen at 1100 hours when traffic is heavy enough that witnesses will see it, but not so heavy that bystanders get hurt, and Richard's people monitoring police channels will hear about it within minutes." I should feel something about this. Horror maybe, or moral objection to using someone's death this way. But the woman in the morgue was already gone, already past caring, and I am still here fighting to stay that way, and James says she had no family, no one to miss her or ask questions, as if he knew I needed that detail to live with this choice. We drive to a vantage point overlooking the highway, a rest area on higher ground where we park among 18-wheelers and early travelers, and James sets up a tablet that shows multiple camera angles, feeds from traffic cameras he accessed through methods I do not want to know about, and we wait in silence while the sun climbs higher and I watch the clock count down to my own death. At 10:58, the black sedan appears on the screen, driving itself through technology I have seen in concept, but never in practice, and it merges into traffic smoothly, and I watch it navigate two-lane changes before accelerating toward the section of highway where the shoulder drops away into rocky descent. James reaches for my hand, and I grip his fingers hard enough to hurt as the car suddenly swerves right, crashes through the guardrail, and disappears from the elevated camera view. And 4 seconds later, a fireball erupts orange and black, climbing into the clear morning sky, and I am watching myself die. Emergency vehicles respond within 6 minutes. Fire trucks and ambulances and police cars converging on the scene, and James pulls up news feeds on his phone, local stations interrupting programming with breaking news of a fatal accident, and within 20 minutes a reporter confirms one fatality, and I see footage of the wreckage, twisted metal still burning, and James turns the screen toward me, showing a text from his contact embedded in the police department, confirming Richard's people already called asking about the victim. "It is done," James says quietly. And I realize I am shaking, tremors running through my entire body. and he pulls me against his chest and wraps his arms around me, and I break silently. No tears, just this terrible shuddering as I comprehend that Eleanor Ashworth is gone, erased, a casualty reported on afternoon news and forgotten by evening, and the only thing solid and real in the entire world is James holding me together while I fall apart. By the afternoon, James confirms that news of my death has reached Richard through 3 separate channels, including the police report, the medical examiner preliminary findings, and a source inside the fire department who Richard has on payroll. And James says now we have the advantage. Now we can move while he thinks you are gone. And I watch him spread maps and floor plans across the table in our new location, another anonymous rental that smells like old carpet in desperation. Richard is holding your father at the Hillcrest estate, James says, tracing a property line on the map. 40 acres outside the city, fortified perimeter, private security, at least 12 guards on rotation, and he is planning to keep Thomas alive just long enough to sign transfer documents that will make the succession look legitimate to the captains who might question a violent takeover. How long, I ask, and James meets my eyes and says 72 hours at most. Richard announced a meeting of the organization leadership for 3 days from now, and that is when he will present the signed documents and your father's tragic sudden death from the stress of losing you. We have to go now, I say, standing up, adrenaline surging hot through my veins. We have to get him out tonight. But James shakes his head and his voice goes hard in that way that means he is about to deny me something. We go when we have a solid plan, he says, when we know the guard rotations and the interior layout, and we have an extraction route that does not get all 3 of us killed. My father does not have time for your careful planning, I snap, and I hear my voice rising. He is being beaten in a basement while you draw maps and calculate odds. James stands too, his height suddenly intimidating in the small room, and he says if we rush in unprepared we die, and your father dies, and Richard wins everything. Is that what you want, Eleanor? Do you want to throw away the advantage your death bought us because you cannot wait 48 hours to do this right? I am not one of your military operations, I say. This is my father, this is my family, and you do not get to tell me to wait while he suffers. James steps closer, and his voice drops low and controlled, and somehow that is worse than if he yelled. Your father hired me because he knew people like you get people like him killed, he says. People who think love is more important than strategy, who rush in on emotion and get everyone killed. And I have spent 6 months keeping you alive by thinking 3 steps ahead while you lived in your luxury prison, not knowing what real survival costs. The words hit like physical blows, and I feel anger flood through me, hot and clarifying. You think I do not know what survival costs, I say. I have watched 4 men die protecting me. I have run through tunnels in blood-soaked shoes. I have burned to death on a highway this morning, so do not tell me I do not understand. James' jaw tightens, and I see something crack in his composure. I cannot lose you, he says, and his voice breaks on the words. I cannot plan an operation where you die, Eleanor. I cannot do this if you are reckless. I stare at him and understand suddenly that his cold calculation has always been fear, that his professional distance is how he survives caring, and I step close enough to touch him. It is too late, I say quietly, too late for both of us. You already care and I already know it, and we are going to get my father out together, carefully and smart and soon, but together. We arrive at the Hillcrest estate separately, me in a catering van with 6 other servers hired through an agency that Richard uses for his business events. Women in black uniforms carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres into the lion's den, and I keep my head down and my dark hair falling forward to hide my face as we pass through the security checkpoint where 2 guards check identification against a list, but barely glance at the servers because we are invisible. Part of the machinery of wealth and power, and I think about how James existed invisible to me for 6 months, and now I understand that camouflage completely. James arrives 20 minutes later in a Mercedes sedan, wearing a tailored suit that transforms him into someone I barely recognize. his posture different, his expression cold and professional as he presents himself at the front entrance as Marcus Webb, security consultant from a firm in Chicago, here for the 4 o'clock interview that Richard scheduled with candidates to upgrade his personal protection. And I watch through the kitchen service window as Richard himself greets James and shakes his hand. And my heart hammers against my ribs because they are 10 feet apart, and Richard has no idea he is welcoming his enemy inside. I circulate through the main hall with a tray of champagne flutes, eyes down, moving through clusters of men in expensive suits, the captains and lieutenants of my father's organization now paying homage to Richard, and I hear fragments of conversation, discussions of territory and product and percentages, the business of crime dressed up in corporate language, and I am searching for the door that leads to the lower level, the wine cellar that James's intelligence said Richard converted into a holding cell. James passes me in the hallway, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second, and in that glance I read confirmation. He has marked the guard positions and confirmed the basement access is through the kitchen service stairs, and I move in that direction with my tray balanced on one hand, like I have done this work my entire life instead of learning it in 3 hours of frantic practice this morning. The kitchen is chaos, chefs and servers moving in coordinated frenzy, and I slip past them to the service stairs, descending into cool darkness that smells like earth and old wine and something else, something sharp like fear and blood. And at the bottom I find a single guard sitting outside a heavy wooden door, and he looks up as I approach with my tray, and I smile and say I was told to bring refreshments down here, playing confused and harmless. The guard stands and I see his hand move toward his weapon, and I know I have seconds before this goes wrong. But then James appears at the top of the stairs moving fast and silent. And the guard turns toward the sound and James is on him, one arm around his throat cutting off air and sound, and the man struggles and goes limp, and James lowers him quietly to the floor. James takes the keys from the guard's belt and unlocks the heavy door, and it swings open into a wine cellar that still holds racks of bottles along 2 walls. But in the center is a chair, and in the chair is my father. And Thomas Ashworth looks up with eyes that are blackened and swollen, and when he sees me, his expression moves through disbelief and hope and fear in the space of a single breath. And I cross the space between us, and kneel in front of him and say we are getting you out, and his voice is hoarse when he says, "Eleanor, you are supposed to be dead," and I say I am, but now I am here, and Thomas looks past me to James, and something passes between them, recognition and respect and trust, and my father nods once and says, "Get me out of this chair and let us go quickly because Richard will know soon." And as if his words summon disaster, the alarm begins to sound throughout the estate, a piercing electronic shriek, and James curses and cuts the zip ties binding my father's wrists and ankles and hauls him to his feet, and we run. We make it halfway up the service stairs before armed men flood the corridors above and below, trapping us on the landing between levels, and James fires twice, dropping the first guard through the door while my father leans heavily against the wall, breathing hard, and I realize he is in no condition to run, and James sees it too, and his jaw tightens as he calculates impossible odds. 3 of us against at least 15 trained men in a fortified location with one exit now blocked, and the other leading directly into the main hall where Richard waits with more security. And I hear footsteps thundering closer from both directions and know we have seconds before this becomes a slaughter. So I grab James's arm and say, "We go up, we go through them, it is the only way." And James looks at me, and then at my father and makes a decision, pulling Thomas upright and half carrying him up the stairs toward the kitchen level, and we burst through the door into chaos, servers screaming and scattering as guards converge from the hallway, and James fires methodically, dropping 2 men while pulling us toward the main hall, because there is nowhere else to go, no exit that is not blocked, and we stumble into the grand entrance space with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and suddenly there is Richard Montague standing at the center of the room surrounded by 8 armed men, and his face when he sees me is shock followed by rage, followed by something like admiration, and he says, "Eleanor Ashworth risen from the dead. How theatrical, how very much your father's daughter. And I feel James shift beside me, positioning himself between Richard and my father. And I know with terrible certainty that James is calculating a sacrifice play, that he intends to draw fire and create an opening for me and Thomas to run, and I cannot let that happen. I will not survive losing him even if my body makes it out of this estate. So I step forward before James can stop me, step into the center of that ring of armed men with my hands visible and empty, and I say, Richard, let us talk about what you actually want here. Let us negotiate like rational people instead of creating more bodies. And Richard laughs and says, there is nothing to negotiate, Eleanor. You die and your father dies, and I take what should have been mine 20 years ago. And I say, except you need legitimacy. You need the captains to follow you without question. And right now you have a problem because I am alive and witnessed, and very much Thomas Ashworth's legal heir, and I can contest everything. I can tie up the organization in legal battles for years. I can burn it all down from inside the system using my mother's family lawyers and their very legitimate, very powerful connections. Or I can give you what you want cleanly. And Richard's eyes narrow, calculating, and I say, I sign over my inheritance. I renounce all claim to the organization. I disappear with my father and James, and you never hear from us again. You get everything without the complication of murdering Thomas Ashworth's daughter in front of 40 witnesses. And Richard tilts his head, considering, and says, why would you give up billions? And I meet his eyes and say, because money is not worth their lives, because I choose freedom over power, because you have already won, Richard. I am just offering you a cleaner victory. And I see my father staring at me, with something like pride breaking through his battered face, and James stands utterly still, his weapon trained on Richard, waiting for my play to resolve. And Richard says, you have one chance to convince me, Eleanor. Tell me why I should believe you will stay gone. I say you should believe me because I have nothing left to fight for in this world except the two men standing behind me, and everything you built this organization on. The power and the territory and the money means nothing to me because I watched it kill my mother slowly from the inside, and I have spent my entire life as a possession instead of a person. And I am done, Richard. I am so completely done. And you can have it all, every dollar, every asset, every connection, because I would rather disappear into nothing with them than rule an empire that requires me to become what you are. And Richard studies me for a long moment while the armed men shift around us, and James remains coiled and ready beside my father. And finally Richard says, you have 24 hours to make this legal, to sign documents that my lawyers will prepare, to transfer everything cleanly. And then you disappear, Eleanor, you and Thomas and your pet soldier. And if I ever see you again or hear your name in connection with this organization, the deal is void, and I will kill all three of you slowly. And I nod once and say agreed, and Richard gestures and his men lower their weapons, and James moves immediately to support my father, who looks like he might collapse. And we walk out of that marble hall through the front entrance past the guards and the catering staff and into the cool evening air, and I do not look back because looking back might shatter the fragile control holding me together. The next 24 hours are a blur of lawyers and documents and wire transfers executed from a conference room in a downtown hotel, where Richard's legal team and my mother's family attorneys negotiate the precise terms of my abdication. And I sign my name, Eleanor Catherine Ashworth, 47 times on papers that strip away my inheritance and my claim and my identity as Thomas Ashworth's heir. And my father sits beside me, watching with an expression I cannot read, something between grief and relief and pride. And when it is finally done and the lawyers leave and we are alone in the hotel room, Thomas says, I am sorry, Eleanor. I am sorry for all of it, for the life I built that nearly killed you, for making you a target, for not seeing Richard's betrayal until it was almost too late, and I take my father's battered hands in mine and say, we are alive. That is enough. We have a chance to choose something different now, and he nods, and there are tears in his eyes, and James stands by the window watching the street below, even now, still protecting us, still vigilant. And I go to him and touch his shoulder, and he turns and looks at me with those steady gray eyes that have seen me through hell. And I say we are free now, we can go anywhere, be anyone, and he says I only want to be wherever you are. And something in my chest breaks open. Not with pain, but with possibility, with hope I did not know I could still feel. We leave the city 3 days later in a car with stolen plates and fake identification documents that James procured through his network. Thomas in the back seat looking 10 years older, but somehow lighter, unburdened by the weight of his empire, and James driving with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near mine on the seat between us. And I watch the skyline disappear behind us and feel no regret, only relief, only the strange lightness of having nothing except the people I chose to keep. And James asks where to, and I say west. Just drive west toward open spaces and small towns where no one knows our names, and we drive.